The first thing they teach you is how to disappear, not vanish. You're still there, boots planted, spine straight, every button catching the light the way it's supposed to, but you learn to make yourself into furniture. You learn to let your eyes settle on a point on the far wall and stay there while the whole world moves around you. People walk past and don't see a man, they see a uniform. They see a post being held. That's the job. That's the whole job, they tell you. And for 3 months, I believed them. My name is Thomas Hale. I was 21 years old the night I learned that standing still can be the loudest thing a person ever does. It was October and the cold had come early that year. I remember that because the stone of the building held it the way stone always does. And by the time my shift started in the early evening, my fingers had already gone stiff inside the gloves. We weren't allowed to flex them. You learn little tricks instead. You pressed your thumb into the inside of your palm slowly, where no one could see, just to keep the blood moving. Sergeant Finch taught me that one. He taught me most of the things that mattered. The hall they put me in that night was called the Crimson Hall, though the man who named it must have had a generous eye, because the curtains had faded over the years to something closer to the color of old wine left out too long. It was a long room with a high ceiling and tall windows down one side, and at the far end a raised platform where on important nights important people stood and said important things to other important people. There were two doors, one at the back wide for the guests to come in through, and one on the side narrow, half hidden by a curtain, the kind of door staff used so they wouldn't be seen. I was placed at the side door. Another man, older, named Davies, was placed at the back. I didn't think anything of it at first. You don't. You're given a position and you take it and you hold it. And if you start asking why you've been put here instead of there, you'll drive yourself out of your own head before the night is half done. So I took my place beside the narrow door, set my eyes on the chandelier hanging dead center of the room, and began to disappear. The clock helped with that. There was a clock on the east wall, an old one, brass and dark wood, with a tick. You could feel as much as hear if the room was quiet enough. Finch had given me the trick of it during my first week. He'd seen me struggling. The long stillness does something to a young man's mind. It fills the empty space with noise, and he leaned in close, barely moving his lips, and said, "Count it." Just that. Count the clock. Let it be the thing your mind holds on to so the rest of you can be still. I've been counting clocks ever since. By that October, I could stand a full 2-hour watch and tell you near enough how many seconds had passed, because I'd counted every one. So I counted and I waited. And for the first half hour, nothing about the night told me it would be any different from the 100 nights before it. Then Jeffrey Wren came through my door. I knew Wren the way you know weather. Not well, but enough to read it. He was one of the senior aides, the men in dark suits who moved through the building like they owned the air in it. And he had a way of looking at a guardsman that made you feel you'd been counted, weighed, and filed away somewhere you'd never see. He came through the narrow door without looking at it, the way men who belong everywhere never look at the doors they use, and he stopped beside me. Close, closer than the aides usually came, and he spoke without turning his head, the way we were trained to speak, so that anyone watching would have seen two men standing near a door and nothing more. "You're the Hale boy," he said, not a question. "Sir?" Finch's. Again, not a question. He already knew. I understood even then that men like Wren never asked anything they didn't already know the answer to. The questions were just a way of letting you know how much they had on you. "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. The clock ticked. I counted it without meaning to. That's how deep the habit ran. 456, there's an address tonight, he said. "You know that." "Yes, sir, mister." "Castle will speak. There will be a number of guests. Some of them are not regular guests." He paused on that just slightly, the way a man pauses on a step. He's not sure will hold his weight. When he speaks, the doors stay shut. Both of them. Nobody comes in. That's ordinary. You've done that before. 9, 10, and nobody goes out. Not until he's finished. Whatever is said, whatever happens in this room, the doors stay shut, and the men at them stay still, especially this one. He let his eyes go, for just a second, to the narrow door beside me. "Do you understand the order?" "Yes, sir." "Say it back to me." That was unusual. I'd taken 1,000 instructions and never once been asked to repeat one. But you don't argue with a man like Wren over a thing like that, so I said it back to him. Low eyes still on the chandelier, the door stays shut, nobody out until Mr. Castle is finished. "Stay still, whatever happens." "Good," he said. And then after a moment, in a voice that had dropped even lower, so low I almost counted it as part of the clock, "It's nothing. It's a formality. Stand your post, and it'll be over before you've had time to wonder about it." Then he was gone, back through the narrow door, and I was alone with my point on the wall, and the cold in my fingers, and a small cold thing that had started somewhere under my ribs that I didn't have a name for yet, because here's what I want you to understand. Stand your post, and it'll be over before you've had time to wonder about it. You don't say that to a man if there's nothing to wonder about. You don't tell someone not to think about a thing unless the thing is the kind that thinks itself into you, whether you want it or not. I had taken 100 orders in 3 months, and not one of them had ever come with a request that I not wonder. Orders don't come with that. Orders come bare. This one came wrapped in something, and the wrapping was the part that worried me. But I was 21 and I had been taught very thoroughly that the holding of the post was the whole of the job. So I held it. I set the small cold thing aside the way you set aside an ache you've decided to deal with later, and I counted the clock and I waited for the room to fill. I should tell you about Finch because you won't understand the rest of this without him. Sergeant Albert Finch had been standing post since before I was born. He was a wide, slow-moving man with a face that gave away nothing, and the younger men were afraid of him in the particular way you're afraid of someone who has never once raised his voice at you. He didn't need to. He had a way of looking at a sloppy salute that made the man giving it want to apologize to his own ancestors. But underneath the stone of him, there was something I didn't see until I'd been under his eye for a few weeks. And once I saw it, I never stopped seeing it. The man cared. Not in any soft way. He cared the way a stonemason cares about a wall. He wanted the thing built right because a wall built wrong falls on people. He took me aside in my second week. I'd done something foolish, broken position to help a guest who dropped something. A small kindness that had felt right in the moment and looked to a passing officer, like a man who couldn't hold his post. I was waiting for the dressing down. Finch didn't give me one. He took me to a quiet corridor and stood with me a while, not saying anything. And then he said, the thing I have carried with me every day since. They'll tell you the job is standing still. He said, it isn't. Any fool can stand still. The job is knowing what your stillness is for. I didn't understand him then. I nodded the way you nod at a thing you think you'll understand later. And he saw that I hadn't got it, and he didn't push. Finch never pushed. He laid things down in front of you and let you come to them in your own time. Because he knew he must have known, having stood so many posts, that some things can't be told. They can only be arrived at. A wall keeps things out. He said, and a wall keeps things in. Same wall. The only difference is which side of it you're on and whether you chose it. He looked at me then properly, which he rarely did. One day someone will use you for a wall, son. Make sure you know what you're holding up before you hold it. Then he sent me back to my post and we never spoke of it again. I thought about it sometimes the way you think about a strange thing. An old man says, turning it over without ever quite getting to the center of it. I didn't know that October night was the center of it. You never do. The lessons that matter don't announce themselves. They just wait the way the clock on the east wall waited, ticking for the hour it had been wound toward all along. Finch wasn't in the Crimson Hall that night. He was somewhere else in the building, holding some other post, and I have wondered since whether things would have gone differently if he'd been at the narrow door instead of me. I've decided they wouldn't have. Not because I'm proud of what I did, because I think Finch had already done it years before in some room I'll never know about, and that's why he was the man he was. The wide, slow stillness of him wasn't the absence of a storm. It was a man who had already been through one and come out the far side knowing exactly what his stillness was for. The guests came in slowly the way they always did, but I knew within the first few minutes that Wren had told the truth about one thing. These were not the regular guests. I had stood enough of these rooms to know the look of the people who usually filled them. There's a particular ease to them, the ease of people who have been in rooms like this their whole lives and expect to be in them for the rest of it. They drift, they find each other, they have a way of standing that says they could leave at any time and simply choose not to. The people coming through the wide door that night didn't have it. They came in looking around. They came in checking the room the way you check a room you've not been in before and aren't sure you're allowed in. Some of them looked frankly uneasy, and they found each other not with the drift of old acquaintance, but with the small, quick glances of people looking for anyone they recognized in a place where they recognized no one. A man near the front kept looking at the platform and then at the doors. Once, twice, 3 times, I counted it the way I counted everything. He was a thin man with gray at his temples and a folder under his arm. He didn't seem to know he was holding too tightly. I didn't know who he was. I knew the type, though. I'd seen it on men who'd come to deliver something and found on arriving that the room was not the room they'd been told it would be. The clock ticked. I counted 40:41. The cold had got into my feet now, as well as my hands, and I pressed my thumb into my palm, slow the old trick, and kept my eyes on the chandelier and let the small cold thing under my ribs sit there without looking at it directly. Davies at the back caught my eye once across the room. We weren't supposed to do that. You don't signal across a post. But he caught my eye for half a second and there was a question in it. And I knew the question because it was the same one sitting in me. Is this right? I gave him nothing back. That was the trained thing to do. And I'm not proud that I did it. Giving a man nothing when he asks you, that is its own kind of answer, and it's not a good one. Then the side door opened, my door, and Jeffrey Wren came through again. And behind him, three other aides I half knew, and they did not look at me at all. They moved along the edge of the room near the front and took up positions there the way men take up positions when they're not guests and don't want to be seen taking them up. One of them stood very near the thin man with the folder. Not threateningly. There's nothing you could have pointed at. He just stood there close, the way a thing stands near another thing it has been placed near. And I understood the way you understand a sentence you've been reading without taking in until the last word lands and the whole shape of it arrives at once. The doors weren't shut for the dignity of the address. The stillness of the men at them wasn't ceremony. I had been placed at the narrow door, the staff door, the one a man might slip out of without crossing the whole bright room, placed there and told, twice made to repeat it. Nobody goes out. I was not the dressing on the occasion. I was the lid on it. Whatever was about to be said in that hall, somebody had decided it would be said to a room that could not leave while it was being said, and could not interrupt, and could not later say it had walked out. And the men who would most want to leave, or interrupt, or be seen refusing to stay, they had been seated near the front, near a quiet man, each near a shut door, each near me. The small, cold thing under my ribs had a name now. I just didn't want to say it to myself yet. The room went quiet without being asked to, the way rooms do when the man they've been waiting for steps up. Edmund Castle came onto the platform. I knew Castle by sight the way everyone in the building did. He was a senior man, one of the ones whose name you heard in corridors, and he had the particular smoothness of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much of himself to show in any given room. He had papers in his hand. He set them on the lectern, looked out over the people who had come, and let the quiet settle another moment before he began. He was good at that. Men like Castle are always good at the silence before they speak. They've learned it does half the work for them. He began to read. I won't pretend to you that I followed every word, because I didn't. I was at my post, and my post was the door, and my eyes were on the chandelier. And a guardsman who turns his head to listen to a speech is a guardsman who has stopped being furniture. But you don't have to turn your head to hear, and what I heard in that smooth, careful, unhurried voice was a statement of things. This is what has been decided. This is what will now be done. This is the position, and it is settled. And your being here tonight is the proof that it was put before everyone properly. And the record will show that no one in this room raised an objection while it was read. That was the shape of it. I didn't have the detail. I'm not sure the detail matters to what I'm telling you. What matters is that as he read, the room began to do something I had never heard a room do during an address. It began very quietly, to move, not loudly. Nobody shouted. These were not people who shouted. But there was a stir, a low current of it, the sound of people turning to the person beside them with their voices down, the sound of, did you agree to this? Were you told about this? This isn't what we... It moved through the hall like wind, moving through long grass, the kind you feel before you see, and Castle kept reading over the top of it in exactly the same unhurried voice, because the voice was part of it. The voice was telling the room that the current didn't exist. That what was being said was simply true, and the saying of it was simply a formality, and there was nothing here for anyone to be moving about. The thin man with the folder stood up. He didn't shout either. He just stood, the way a man stands when he has reached the edge of what he can do sitting down. And he said something. I didn't catch the words. The distance ate them, but I caught the shape. And the shape was, this was not agreed. 3 or 4 words and a folder held up slightly. The way you hold up a thing you brought to prove you were promised something else. The aide standing near him stepped very smoothly half in front of him. Not a shove, not anything you could ever describe to someone who wasn't there as a thing that had happened. He simply, gently, was suddenly between the thin man and the platform, and he said something to him low and put a hand not quite on his arm. And the thin man, after a moment, with the slow defeated motion of a man, realizing the room has been built around him and not for him, sat back down. And Castle kept reading. I counted the clock. I had to... It was the only thing that kept the rest of me where it had been put. 61, 62. The chandelier was very bright and very still, and I held my eyes on it, and underneath my ribs, the cold thing had stopped being cold and started being something worse, something hot, and I knew now exactly what it was, and I could no longer pretend to myself that I didn't. This was the thing Finch had told me about. One day, someone will use you for a wall. I was the wall, not a wall around a thing that needed guarding, a wall around a room full of people so that something could be said to them that several of them had not agreed to and could not, while it was being said, get up and walk away from without walking past me. My stillness wasn't holding up the dignity of the occasion. My stillness was the occasion. Without the doors held shut and the men at them still, Castle would have been reading to a room that was emptying. With us there, he was reading to a room that was trapped. And the difference between those two things, the entire difference was me and Davies and whether we stood where we'd been told to stand. Make sure you know what you're holding up before you hold it. I knew now. That was the trouble. There's a kind of peace in not knowing. Ren had tried to give me that peace. It's nothing. Stand your post. It'll be over before you've had time to wonder. He hadn't been threatening me. That's the part I understood standing there. He'd been offering me something, the gift of not having known. If I just held the post and kept my eyes on the light and counted the clock, then whatever happened in that room would have happened to me as much as through me, and I could carry it the rest of my life as a thing I'd been part of without ever quite having chosen. A great many of the worst things that have ever been done were done by men holding posts and counting clocks and being grateful afterward that no one had made them look directly at it. I was 21. I want you to keep remembering that because I have to. The thin man stood up again. I don't know where he found it. He'd been put back in his seat once, gently, by a room built to put him back in it. And he stood up again anyway, and this time he didn't try to speak over the distance. This time he turned and he began to move, not toward the platform he'd learned in the few minutes since the first time, that the platform was the one place the room would not let him reach. He turned the other way. He turned toward the side of the hall, toward the curtain, toward the narrow staff door, and he began walking toward it with the fast, low, head-down walk of a man who has decided that the only thing left to do is to not be in the room while this is said, so that whatever the record says, it will not be able to say he stayed. He was walking toward me. I understood what he was doing with a clarity I have rarely had about anything since. He wasn't running. He wasn't making a scene. He had grasped, faster than I had, exactly what the room was for, and he had found the one act left to a man inside a room like that. You cannot stop a thing being said, but you can refuse to be counted among those who heard it and stayed. You can walk out. The walking out is the whole of protest, and it is a real protest. And the only thing standing between that man and the dignity of having refused was a curtain, a narrow door, and me, Jeffrey Wren, was at the front of the hall. He had been near Castle the whole time, half in shadow, doing the thing men like him do, which is to be present at the thing without being in any photograph of it. And when the thin man turned and began his walk toward my door, Wren looked at me. Across the whole length of that room, over the heads of all those trapped and murmuring people, Wren found my eyes, which were not supposed to be findable. That was the entire point of how I'd been trained. And he held them, and he did a small thing with his head, barely a movement, a fraction, toward the door, toward the man walking to it, the order, giving the way real orders are always given, without a word, in a room full of witnesses, in a way that would never be a thing anyone could later prove was given. Stop him. Stand in the door, be the wall. That's what you're for. And here's the truth of that moment, and I've never dressed it up for anyone, and I won't for you. Everything in me that had been built over 3 months said yes. Not yes because I agreed with it. Yes because that was the shape my whole training had poured me into. A guardsman holds his post. A guardsman takes the order. A guardsman does not decide in the middle of a hall, in front of everyone, which orders are the real ones the body wants to obey. People think courage is a feeling, and it isn't. The feeling is all on the other side. The feeling is every nerve you have telling you to do the thing you were told, because the thing you were told is the path with no cliff in it. And the other path, the one where you do not do as Wren's head told you to do, that path has nothing under it that you can see at all. The thin man was close now, 10 feet. I could see his face. He wasn't a brave-looking man. That's the part I've never forgotten. He looked frightened and tired and ordinary, a man with gray at his temples holding a folder, and he was doing the bravest thing in that room. And he didn't look brave at all. He just looked like he'd decided and was too scared to stop now. I had perhaps 3 seconds. I counted them. I count everything. 1, Finch's voice. From a corridor 2 weeks into my life as a guardsman. The job is knowing what your stillness is for. 2, a wall keeps things in, same wall. The only difference is which side you're on and whether you chose it. 3, I want to tell you I made a great decision. I didn't. I want to tell you that a clear voice spoke in me and I rose to it. It didn't. What happened was smaller than that, and I think that's why it's the truest thing I know. I didn't lunge to stop him, and I didn't throw the door open and shout. I did the smallest possible thing. The thing that, if you'd been in that room, you might not even have seen. I took one step to the side. That was all. The man came to the narrow door and the place where I had been standing directly in front of it, the wall, the lid. I was no longer standing there. I had moved one pace, the width of a man, and I had put my hand on the door and I had opened it. Not flung, opened, the way a man opens a door for someone. And I stood beside it, the way I had been trained to stand beside everything perfectly still, eyes forward, furniture, and I let him through it. He stopped for just a moment in the doorway. He looked at me. I have thought about that. Look for the rest of my life. He didn't thank me. There wasn't time, and it wasn't the kind of thing you thank a man for in front of the people who would punish him for it. He just looked at me for the length of one tick of the clock, and something passed between us that I have never had words for and have stopped trying to find them for, and then he was through and gone. And the narrow door swung shut behind him on its own slow hinge, and the sound it made was very small in that enormous room. Across the hall, Jeffrey Wren was looking at me, and his face had not changed at all. And that was somehow the worst part. He didn't glare, he didn't react, he simply looked at me the way you look at a tool that has been found at the moment you needed it to be the wrong tool, and then he looked away back toward the platform and went on being a man who was not in any photograph. Castle had stopped reading. The room had heard the door. A room that has been straining at a held silence will hear a small door from 50 feet, and they had all turned, and there was a moment, I will swear to this for as long as I live, there was a moment of complete stillness in that hall that was not the stillness anyone had ordered. It was the other kind. It was the stillness of a great many people all realizing at once the same thing, that the door had not been locked, that it had only ever been a man standing in front of it, and that a man, it turned out, could step aside. It did not go the way Jeffrey Wren wanted it to go. I have had a long time to think about why, and I think the answer is simpler and stranger than I understood at 21. Wren had built a very careful room. Every part of it was designed to make the saying of a thing into a thing that had been done properly, with everyone present, no one objecting. The doors merely shut for dignity. The men at them merely standing as men at doors. The entire structure depended on no part of it ever being visible as a structure. The moment one narrow door opened and one tired man walked out of it, and a whole hall turned to watch him go. The moment, in other words, that the room could see itself, it stopped being a room where a thing had been properly announced and became a room where a great many people had watched a man have to escape from an announcement. You cannot put that back. Once a room has seen the shape of what it is, the shape is all anyone remembers. What happened in the days after is not really my story to tell, and I've always been careful telling it, because the men it concerns were more powerful than me, and the thing that was almost said in that hall was never, in the end, said the way it was meant to be. The address did not become what it was built to become. Questions were asked by people whose questions could not be stepped gently in front of. The thin man with the folder, whose name I did learn afterward and have always kept to myself, turned out to have been right about what he stood up to say, and the fact that he had walked out rather than sat through it mattered. Later, to people deciding which version of that night to believe, a door held shut and a room that stayed is one kind of evidence. A man who walked out is another kind. I had, without quite meaning to, changed which kind of evidence that night would be. They did not punish me the way Wren wanted. I think he wanted to very much, and I think he found, when he reached for the means to, that he could not do it without explaining what I had done and why it had mattered. And explaining that meant describing the room, and describing the room was the one thing the room had been built to prevent. The structure that had been meant to trap a hall full of people turned out, in the end, to also trap the man who built it. He could not punish me loudly without saying out loud what I had refused to be part of. So it was done quietly, the way those things are, in the form of postings I didn't want and advancements that went to other men, and I have never minded that as much as I think I was supposed to. Sergeant Finch found me 2 nights later. I was standing a post, a cold one, a nothing one, the kind you get given when someone wants you to understand something without saying it, and he came and stood near me, the way he had that first time 2 years, almost to the look of it, slow and wide and giving nothing away. He didn't ask me what had happened. He'd have known. Men like Finch always know. The building tells them. It tells them in the way other men go quiet when a name comes up. He stood beside me a while and let the clock tick, and then he said, not looking at me, in the flat voice he used for the things he meant most, you found out what your stillness was for. That was all. He didn't say I'd done well. I don't think by the rules he lived under. that he was allowed to, and I don't think it would have meant as much if he had. He said, I'd found out what it was for, and that was the whole of it. Because that had always been the whole of it, the thing he'd laid in front of me in a corridor when I was new and let me carry unopened until the night I needed it. Then he straightened and adjusted something on his uniform that didn't need adjusting and went back to his own post, and we never spoke of it again. We didn't have to. Some things, once they've been arrived at, don't need to be said. That was a thing Finch knew, and it was the last thing he taught me without teaching it. I'm an old man now, or near enough that the young men hold doors for me, which is its own quiet joke. I won't explain to them. I left the regiment a long time ago. The building still stands. The Crimson Hall is still there. I'm told the curtain's a little more the color of old wine each year. The clock on the east wall still ticking, still being counted, I'd guess, by some boy of 21 pressing his thumb into his palm to keep the blood moving and waiting for a night he doesn't know is coming. People ask me sometimes when they learn I stood those posts, when they want a story. What the bravest thing I ever saw was they expect, I think, something with a sword in it, something at a gate, in front of a crowd, the kind of thing that gets filmed. I never tell them about the hall. It isn't a story that works out loud. There's no shouting in it. Nobody draws anything. The whole of it is a tired man with a folder and a clock ticking and a guardsman taking one step to the side. And if you tell it to someone expecting a sword, they look at you like you've forgotten the ending. But I'll tell you, because you've stayed this long, the thing it taught me, and it's the only thing I really know, after all those years of standing still, they tell you the job is silent. And it is. A guard's silence is real and it matters, and there is honor in it, the not speaking, the not moving, the holding of a thing so other people can rely on it being held. I have never once been sorry for the silences I kept that were mine to keep, but there's another silence and it wears the same uniform and it stands at the same doors, and from the outside you cannot tell them apart. It is the silence that is not yours. It is the stillness someone else has decided to use, the wall they need you to be, the not moving that isn't duty at all, but only obedience wearing duty's coat. And the terrible thing, the thing no one warns you about because the warning wouldn't take until the night arrives, is that the second silence asks nothing of you. It asks you only to do what you were already doing, to stand where you were already standing, to let a thing happen by being exactly furniture. The hardest order I was ever given was the order to do nothing. Everything in me was already built to obey it. It would have cost me nothing in the moment and everything for the rest of my life, and I would never have known, because that's the mercy and the trap of it. You don't find out what the stillness was for unless you break it. And most men, given the gift of not having to know, take it and stand their post and count their clock and are grateful. I took one step